The champagne sparkled under the chandelier like liquid gold. Laughter rippled across the hall until my daughter-in-law's voice sliced through the air. "Security, please escort this woman out. She doesn't belong here." Every head turned. My hand still clutching a small wrapped gift trembled. Vanessa stood in the center of her charity gala, a diamond smile fixed on her face. Her gown shimmered like silver rain, and her tone carried the kind of sweetness that makes poison taste polite. "She's not on the guest list," she said coolly. "This is a private event for professionals." Gasps fluttered around the room. A waiter froze mid-step, unsure whether to keep serving. I could feel eyes on my back, some curious, some pitying, some quietly amused. I took a breath, steady, searching for my son's face across the ballroom. But Ethan Monroe, my only child, turned away, pretending to listen to a conversation that wasn't happening. For a moment, the marble floor seemed to tilt under my old shoes. The music dimmed. The soft glow of chandeliers blurred behind a wash of shame. Humiliation burns hotter when it comes from your own blood. The two guards started toward me, and I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall, an old woman holding a gift no one wanted. Then, as the air tightened, a deep voice cut through the silence from the stage. "Stop. That's my mother." Everything froze. The violinist stopped mid-bow. Glasses paused in mid-air. The CEO of Monroe Enterprises, my son, had finally looked up. Vanessa's face drained of color, her smile collapsing like a wilting flower. And in that frozen second I knew this wasn't the end of my humiliation. It was the beginning of my justice. The gala lights flared back to life, but the room had changed. Conversations whispered like insects in the corners. The guards hesitated, glancing between Vanessa and Ethan. I could see Ethan's jaw tightening the same way it used to when he was caught doing wrong as a boy. He walked toward me, his polished shoes loud on the marble, his voice low but sharp. "Mom, you shouldn't have come," he muttered. "I just came to celebrate your success," I said quietly, holding out the small box wrapped in blue paper. "That's all." Vanessa stepped closer, still smiling for the audience but whispering through her teeth, "You're making a scene." I wasn't the one who called security. I answered, my tone calm, but my spine straight as steel. A murmur rippled through the guests. Someone whispered, "That's his mother." Another voice said, "God, she looks so ordinary." Ethan's voice faltered. "Let's talk outside, Mom." "No," I said, keeping my eyes on him. "We'll talk right here. Since your wife decided to make it public." The room went still again. Vanessa's smile cracked, but she kept her head high, trying to control the narrative. "Ethan, please, we can deal with this later. She clearly doesn't understand how these events work." "I understand perfectly," I said. "They work best when people remember their manners." The words hung in the air like smoke. Someone at the back chuckled quietly. Ethan looked mortified. Vanessa's nails dug into her clutch so hard I thought it might tear. The guard stepped back, awkward, now that the CEO's mother had just refused to leave. I took a slow breath, willing my hands to stop shaking. Years of cleaning hotel floors had taught me balance, the kind that doesn't depend on grace, only endurance. I straightened my shoulders, nodded toward Ethan, and said softly enough for only him to hear, "You can look away from me, son, but you can't erase where you came from." He swallowed hard. The silence that followed was so thick, I could hear the crystal chandeliers hum. I felt 100 eyes waiting, measuring, deciding which side to take. Then I turned to Vanessa. "I didn't mean to ruin your party, dear," I said, with a small smile. "But it seems the invitation got confused." "Don't worry, I won't stay long." Her lips curled. "That would be best." I nodded slowly, and as I turned to go, a voice from the corner called out, "Is she really your mother, Mr. Monroe?" Ethan hesitated, then said, "Yes, she is." That was the moment the tide shifted. People who had laughed fell silent. The reporters at the back lifted their cameras. The story was no longer about a nobody at a fancy party. It was about a mother and a son divided by pride under chandeliers. Vanessa forced another brittle laugh. "Let's all calm down, shall we? I'm sure Mrs. Monroe just but." The words died when Ethan stepped forward, took the microphone from the MC and said clearly, "My mother worked her whole life to raise me. If she wants to stand in this room, she has more right to be here than any of us." Applause didn't come. The shock was too heavy. People shifted, uncertain whether to clap or keep quiet. Vanessa's hand slipped from his arm, her ring catching the light like a warning. I stood there stunned, not from pride but from the sudden weight of being seen again. After years of invisibility, of being the background in my own family's photograph, my son had finally said my name aloud. But the damage had already been done. Every bruise in my chest from years of disregard began to surface. I turned to him and said softly, "It's all right, Ethan. You don't have to defend me. You just have to remember me." He looked like he wanted to speak, but I held up a hand and walked past him, the hem of my simple navy dress brushing the marble floor. Cameras followed me as I reached the entrance. I could feel Vanessa's gaze burning between my shoulders. At the door, I paused and looked back once. Ethan stood under the chandelier, shoulders slumped, surrounded by silence and luxury. Vanessa beside him, pale and trembling behind her perfect mask. The music finally resumed, but it sounded hollow, like a celebration for people who'd just been unmasked. Outside, the night air felt cool, almost kind. The city glittered beyond the glass doors, unaware of the small storm that had just passed inside. I stood under the golden lights of the hotel sign and let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "They called me a nobody," I murmured to myself. "But the night's not over yet." I tightened my coat around me, the small gift still in my hand. The silver paper had a crease now, but I didn't mind. I'd learned long ago that even the most wrinkled things can still hold value. As I walked down the steps, the doorman opened the door and said softly, "Good night, Mrs. Monroe." I smiled faintly. For the first time in years, someone said my name with respect. And as I stepped into the quiet street, I made a promise, not out loud, but deep inside, where resolve lives. The next time they saw me, I wouldn't be the guest at their party. I would be the name on the building itself. The wedding was beautiful in the way magazine covers are beautiful, perfect lighting, perfect flowers, and nothing real underneath. It took place in Vanessa's family garden in Buckhead, where lanterns floated in trees like captured stars. Everyone wore pastel silk and champagne smiles. I sat in the last row in a navy dress I'd kept from my sister's funeral, holding a bouquet of wild daisies. They didn't match the roses on the tables, but they were mine. When the string quartet began canon in D, I felt a strange hollowness in my chest. They called it a union. To me, it felt like a farewell. When the officiant announced Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Monroe, the crowd cheered, cameras flashed and glasses clinked. My name wasn't printed on the program, not even under family. I stared at the paper, my thumb tracing the empty space where I should have been. When I asked Vanessa about it later, she smiled as if I'd said something silly. "Oh, that must have been the planner's oversight," she said, brushing invisible dust from her designer gown. But her eyes held none of the apology her lips offered. During the reception, I wandered near the buffet to catch my breath. One of Vanessa's friends whispered to another, "Who's that?" "The caterer." I almost laughed. Ethan was too busy shaking hands with investors to notice. I stood by the champagne tower, invisible in plain sight. Later, when I approached to hug him, Vanessa slipped between us and handed me an empty plate. "Mom, why don't you help yourself first? There's still shrimp left." Her tone was sweet as sugar, but it landed like salt in a wound. After the wedding, I visited their new home, a penthouse that smelled of marble and eucalyptus candles. The view stretched over all of Atlanta, a city I'd cleaned for half my life. I brought them a housewarming gift, a quilt I'd stitched from scraps of Ethan's old shirts. Vanessa accepted it with 2 fingers as though it might stain her nails. "Oh," she said lightly, "that's so nostalgic." She draped it over a chair that matched nothing else in the room. I tried to ignore the sting. "You have a beautiful place," I said. "Thank you," she replied. "We wanted something that reflects our lifestyle. Ethan deserves that, don't you think?" My son smiled, tired and proud. "We've both worked hard for it, Mom." Vanessa added, "The maid will keep everything spotless, of course." She glanced at me as she said it, her eyes gleaming. "No more scrubbing floors for you, Mrs. Monroe." Mrs. Monroe, not Mom, not even Ella. Just a polite wall of syllables. I felt my throat tighten, but I swallowed it. "That's kind of you," I said. "But some habits don't wash off easily." Her laugh was soft but hollow. I can imagine. In the months that followed, I saw them less and less. Ethan used to call every Sunday. Now his calls came with meetings in the background and a clock in his tone. Sorry, Mom, can we talk later? Vanessa and I are hosting tonight. Later never came. When I texted to ask about dinner, she replied for him, Ethan's really busy these days, but we'll plan something soon. Soon stretched into 6 months. When they finally invited me to brunch, it was at a rooftop restaurant full of crystal glasses and city views. I wore my best outfit, a pressed white blouse, and the silver pendant Ethan had given me on his high school graduation. Vanessa looked immaculate in beige silk. She ordered for all of us, then leaned toward the waiter. And could you bring her tea in a to-go cup? She likes it simple. The waiter hesitated. Ethan looked away. I smiled tightly. Porcelain will do just fine. Vanessa laughed. Oh, I just thought, never mind. A friend of hers joined halfway through and seeing me asked your assistant, Vanessa giggled. Something like that. The laughter that followed sounded delicate and poisonous. I didn't say a word. Humiliation doesn't always come as a slap. Sometimes it's a slow drizzle that soaks through the skin. When the bill came, Ethan reached for it, but Vanessa laid a manicured hand on his wrist. Mom insisted on treating us, she said, even though I hadn't. Everyone at the table turned toward me waiting. My throat burned as I nodded. Of course, I said, sliding my card forward. Pride has many currencies. That day, mine was $186. Back home, I sat in the dark and listened to the rain on my porch. I thought about my husband long gone, and the nights I'd stayed up sewing clothes for Ethan when we couldn't afford new ones. I remembered the boy who used to call me Mama and run into my arms after baseball games. Somewhere between then and now, the world had convinced him that love meant distance, that money meant worth. Weeks passed. They didn't visit. My calls went to voicemail. I sent a birthday card that came back unopened, stamped return to sender. It was addressed correctly. I kept it anyway. Then one Sunday they arrived at my house unannounced. Vanessa carried a folder. Ethan looked uneasy. Mom, he began carefully, we've been thinking. I waited. This house is a lot for you to manage alone, Vanessa said. We found a lovely senior living community. You'd have help, friends your age, activities, the words blurred. I looked from one to the other, searching for the son who once promised never to let me be lonely. You want to move me out, I said quietly. Ethan rubbed his neck. We just think it'd be safer. Safer, I repeated. Or quieter for you, Vanessa smiled thinly. Please don't take it the wrong way. We only want what's best. What's best, I said. Or what's convenient. Her expression didn't change. You're overreacting. I stood my pulse steady. You've built a beautiful life, both of you. I just didn't realize you needed to erase me to make room for it. Ethan tried to speak, but the words fell apart. I saw his shoulders sag, the conflict flickering in his eyes, but he didn't stop her. Silence is its own betrayal. When they left, the house felt smaller. I poured tea into the cracked mug I'd used for 30 years and whispered to the empty room. They think they're saving me. They're really just saving face. That night, I took out my old notebook, the one where I used to record every dollar I earned from cleaning offices and stocking shelves. I turned to a fresh page and wrote a single line. If they can forget where they come from, then I can remember who I am. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, rattling the loose pane in the kitchen. I let it sing. Some storms don't arrive with thunder. They begin with a whisper, the kind that says enough. In that moment, sitting under a flickering light with my hands still trembling from hurt, I didn't yet know what I would do. Only that I would never again apologize for taking up space at my own table. It started with the charity gala. Vanessa's company was hosting it in partnership with a luxury hotel group, a night of glittering gowns and calculated smiles. I saw the announcement on television while folding laundry, Ethan's name printed beside hers on the sponsor list. The news anchor called them Atlanta's power couple. My son's smile looked rehearsed, his arm around her waist like a trophy placed in position. I hadn't been invited, of course. I didn't expect to be. But that night, as I stared at the screen, I felt the first real fracture, not in my heart but in my patience. They'd worked hard to build their image, and I'd helped fund parts of it without them even realizing. Over the years, I'd signed quiet loans, covered small gaps, and never once mentioned it. I thought I was protecting them. I see now I was just feeding a wolf in silk. A week later, Vanessa called for the first time in months. Her tone was syrupy sweet. "Mom, the company's having a small family night next Saturday. Ethan thought you might enjoy it." Her voice said, "Invitation." Her subtext said, "Performance." I paused. "What should I wear?" "Oh, anything comfortable," she said. "It's just casual." Casual for Vanessa meant diamonds disguised as simplicity. I thanked her and hung up, staring at the phone until the line went cold. Then I smiled. "All right, dear," I whispered to no one. "Let's play casual." When I arrived that evening, the hotel glowed like a chandelier against the night. Rolls-Royces lined the driveway, waiters glided through the lobby with silver trays, and a jazz band played soft notes that melted into the hum of expensive laughter. I wore a gray wool coat, the same one I'd mended twice that winter, and carried a small clutch that had belonged to my mother. The moment I stepped into the ballroom, heads turned. I wasn't part of the decor. Vanessa's friends wore sequined gowns. I wore memory and thread. I found her near the bar, wrapped in silver satin, laughter spilling easily as she greeted guests. When she spotted me, her face froze for half a breath, before she rearranged it into politeness. "Mom, you made it," she exclaimed, air kissing my cheek without letting her lips touch. "Oh, you didn't tell me you'd wear gray." "The photographers are doing a winter theme, it might blend with the backdrop." "Then I suppose I'll be right where I belong," I said, smiling. Ethan appeared beside her, glass of champagne in hand. "Mom, I didn't think you'd come." "You invited me, didn't you?" I asked. "Vanessa did," he said, lightly. "But I'm glad you're here." For the next hour I floated like a ghost between tables, invisible but observed. People spoke over me as if I were furniture. When I reached for an hors d'oeuvre, a waiter hesitated, unsure whether I was staff or guest. At one point I overheard a group of women at the table behind me. "That must be Ethan's mother," one whispered. "She's quaint." "Quaint," the other repeated. "That's polite for poor." The laughter that followed was muffled by crystal rims. I didn't turn around. I'd learned long ago that dignity doesn't shout, it endures. When dinner was announced, a maitre d' guided everyone to their assigned seats. My name wasn't on any card. I stood awkwardly until Vanessa came over, her smile tight. "Mom, we're actually full at the family table. Maybe you can join the partners section." The partners section was near the back, beside the service door. I sat alone between two couples who avoided eye contact. The band began playing and the speeches started. Ethan went on stage talking about the Monroe legacy of excellence. Vanessa beamed beside him, every inch of her gleaming under the lights. I clapped when the crowd did, though my hands barely touched. Halfway through the meal, a server spilled wine near Vanessa's shoes. The red splash on her pale gown drew gasps. She stood abruptly, glare sharp enough to cut glass. "Can someone handle this?" she snapped. Then her eyes landed on me. "Mom, why don't you?" she started, then stopped, realizing the implication too late. The table went still. I saw the panic flash across Ethan's face, the way his jaw tightened. My pulse slowed to something calm, deliberate. I rose slowly. "Why don't I?" "What, dear?" she stammered. "I just never mind." The silence spread like ink. I smiled faintly and said, "Accidents happen, Vanessa. Wine washes out. Pride doesn't." Ethan looked down. No one else spoke. The music played on, but the rhythm had turned brittle. I excused myself before dessert, leaving the ballroom for the cool night outside. The valet didn't notice me at first. He was busy rushing luxury cars forward. When he finally brought my old sedan around, I heard two guests whisper as they passed, "She must be a driver." The words didn't sting as much as I thought they would. I'd been mistaken for worse things in my life. I drove home in silence, the radio off, the city lights flickering like distant candles. Somewhere between downtown and my street, I realized something had shifted. I was done waiting for kindness from people who used it as currency. At home, I boiled water for tea and sat at the kitchen table. The house creaked with winter wind, but it was honest noise. I opened my old ledger and wrote, "Their empire is built on glass. I have the hammer." Over the following weeks, I began collecting old documents, receipts, loan agreements I'd co-signed to help Ethan start his first venture, copies of stock certificates from Aurora Investments, the parent company they'd long forgotten existed because I'd hidden it under another name. I found the key in my jewelry box, the one to the safe deposit box I hadn't opened in years. Inside were files that could change everything: ownership papers, investment ledgers, signatures made in my careful hand. That night I called my oldest friend Evelyn, who still worked as a paralegal downtown. "Do you still have contacts in corporate law?" I asked. She hesitated. "Ella, what are you doing?" "Tidying up," I said. "Just old debt." When I hung up, I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet wrap around me. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the faint hiss of the heater, ordinary sounds of survival. Somewhere out there, Vanessa was probably asleep under 1,000 thread count sheets, believing she'd won the game. But games end when the real player stops pretending to lose. I looked around my little kitchen, the chipped tiles, and the wooden table I'd kept since Ethan was 5. Everything here had been bought with work, not performance. That was the difference. She wore luxury. I wore proof. I ran my thumb along the rim of my teacup and whispered to the dark, "They think they've seen the last of me." The wind pressed against the window, rattling the glass like a promise. Let's see how they handle truth when it shows up in heels and gray wool. The night air outside the Copper Finch carried the scent of roasted almonds and expensive regret. Inside, the crowd had thinned. Only a few guests lingered, whispering behind wine glasses. I sat at the table that once refused to hold my presence. The linen was smooth, the candles burned low, and the silence tasted sweet. For years I'd been invisible. Tonight I was unforgettable. Vanessa stood across the room, her mascara smudged, her hands trembling around her clutch. Ethan hovered beside her face, pale, voice lost. When the manager approached me, I nodded for him to bring a new bottle. "The same one," I said. "Let's make sure they see who's really paying." His respectful bow told the whole room what they hadn't realized: the woman they'd called an embarrassment was the name on their paychecks. When I rose from the table, the murmur grew louder. I could hear fragments of disbelief. "She owns this place. Is that true, Caldwell Holdings?" I didn't have to answer. My silence did the talking. I walked toward Vanessa and Ethan, my heels slow and deliberate against the wood floor. Vanessa lifted her chin, desperate to recover her composure. "You didn't have to humiliate us," she hissed through a brittle smile. I smiled back, calm as still water. "I didn't. You did that all by yourself." Ethan reached out. "Mom, please. Let's go somewhere private." I stopped him with a look. "No, son. We're already where this should happen. In the light." For a long moment, no one moved. The jazz band had fallen silent. Even the waiters stood still. Then I turned to the crowd and said clearly, "Some lessons don't need classrooms. Just witnesses." The next morning, headlines caught fire. "Hidden owner exposes family at gala. The Copper Finch's true founder revealed." My phone vibrated until I switched it off. I didn't care for gossip. I cared for consequence. Ethan didn't call for 3 days. When he finally did, his voice was hoarse. "Mom, the board's in chaos. The PR team says we have to spin this." "Spin it however you like," I said evenly. "But don't spin the truth." He hesitated. "Vanessa's been crying. She says she didn't mean what? To treat me like a stain on your carpet. Tell her she succeeded." He started to argue, but I hung up. My hand shook, not from anger but from the exhaustion that comes after a storm. By the 5th day, the public had chosen sides. Half praised me as a symbol of dignity. The other half called it revenge. Let them. Justice doesn't need good press. It only needs balance. Reporters waited outside my townhouse, asking how a cleaning woman had built a restaurant empire in silence. I gave them nothing but one sentence: I worked and I didn't talk. That was enough to keep them guessing. Behind closed doors, the real reckoning began. Ethan's company shares were frozen under review. Vanessa was removed from the charity board pending image restoration. Invitations dried up like spilled champagne. Friends who once toasted her at parties avoided her calls. Meanwhile, I returned to my routines: morning tea, bookkeeping, long walks by the Savannah River. Freedom feels quiet when you've earned it honestly. Yet deep down, I knew something was unfinished. Revenge burns quick, lessons take longer. A week later, Ethan came to see me. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically but in spirit. The tailored suit hung loose at his shoulders. He stood at my door like a boy, asking permission to come home. "Can we talk?" he asked. I poured him coffee. The silence between us was heavy but not hostile. "I shouldn't have let it go that far," he said finally. "I thought you'd embarrass us." I studied him for a long moment. "Embarrass who, Ethan, you or the version of yourself you think people love?" He stared into his cup. "I don't know anymore." I leaned back. "Then it's time you start learning." The next afternoon I called my lawyer. "Prepare a transfer review," I told her. "I want full audit control of all assets tied to Monroe Enterprises." "Even your sons?" she asked cautiously. "Especially my sons," I replied. By Friday the documents were ready. I sent word for Ethan and Vanessa to meet me in the boardroom of the Copper Finch. When they arrived, Vanessa looked like she'd aged 10 years. No jewelry, no entourage, just nerves and hollow pride. I waited until they sat, then placed 2 thick envelopes on the table. "You've both lived comfortably off what I built," I began. "Now you'll live truthfully by it." Vanessa's eyes darted toward Ethan. "What are these?" "Proof," I said. "Every tuition, payment, mortgage, guarantee car title, business loan, I covered them all. You built your life with my credit. So now you'll repay it honestly." Ethan frowned. "Mom, we can't just—" "You can," I interrupted. "But not with money. You'll repay it in honor." Vanessa blinked. "Honor?" "Yes," I said softly. "You'll work under the name you once despised. Caldwell. I'll give you jobs in my company. Real jobs. Not titles to hide behind." Ethan's face flushed. "You're punishing us." "No," I said, sliding the contracts across the table. "I'm saving you from becoming people you can't come back from." The first contract read, Maintenance Supervisor Aurora Holdings. $18 an hour. The second, Assistant Cook Copper Finch Kitchen. $15 an hour. Vanessa gasped. "You expect me to wash dishes. I expect you to understand what clean means," I replied. Ethan's voice broke. "You can't." "I can," I said. And I already did. For a moment no one spoke. Only the quiet hum of the building filled the air, the heartbeat of a place I had built with my own cracked hands. Vanessa's fingers trembled. "You're humiliating us." I looked her straight in the eyes. "No, dear. I'm teaching you humility. There's a difference." Ethan pushed the papers away. "You think this will fix everything. It won't," I said. "But it will start something honest. You'll work 6 months. You'll earn your own respect. After that, we'll see what's left." He sat back, breathing hard, anger and shame mixing on his face. Then slowly he picked up the pen. "If this is what you need," he said, "I'll do it." Vanessa stared at him disbelieving. "Ethan, no," he met her gaze. "We owe her that much." Her hand trembled as she signed beside his name. I took the contracts, folded them neatly and said welcome to real work. As they left, I watched their silhouettes fade down the hall. For the first time in years, their shoulders didn't carry arrogance. They carried weight. Real honest weight. When the door closed, I sat for a while, letting the quiet settle. Outside dusk painted the city gold. I thought of the woman I used to be, the one scrubbing motel floors for strangers, believing love could erase shame. That woman had never asked for repayment. But tonight she finally received it, not in dollars but in dignity. The phone rang once more, my lawyer checking in. "Everything signed?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "They start Monday." She paused. "You sound peaceful." "I am," I told her. "I used to think revenge was loud. Turns out, it's quiet, and it smells like soap." When I hung up, I looked out at the city lights flickering alive one by one. Somewhere out there my son and his wife were realizing that forgiveness isn't free, and I, for the first time in my long, hard life, felt no anger left, only the slow, steady satisfaction of justice done with grace. I closed my ledger, turned off the light and whispered to the empty room, "Let the work begin." The ballroom glittered again that night, but this time it wasn't for celebration, it was for reckoning. Vanessa's charity board had arranged another fundraiser, hoping to scrub away the gossip that still stained their names. I hadn't planned to go. But when I received the invitation unsigned slipped under my door, I knew who had sent it: Ethan. Maybe guilt, maybe pride. Either way, I decided to attend. The copper finch's chandeliers were brighter than ever, every crystal polished to a blinding shine. The crowd buzzed with money and perfume. As I stepped inside, the air seemed to hush by itself. I wore the same navy dress I'd been mocked for before, but this time I walked with my chin high. Every head turned. No one laughed. The whispers were different now, curious, cautious, reverent. At the far end of the room, Vanessa stood by the stage, dazzling in a silver gown that didn't hide her tension. Her fingers twisted the stem of her glass until it nearly cracked. When she saw me, her lips curved into a fragile smile. "Mrs. Monroe," she said, voice sweet as lemon on a cut. "You came." "I was invited," I said evenly. It seemed polite to show up when summoned. Her eyes flicked toward Ethan, who stood on stage behind the microphone, greeting guests. The lights gleamed off his cufflinks, the same kind he'd once hidden from me as a sign of success. Now they looked more like armor than pride. The event began with applause and practiced speeches. Wealthy patrons promised donations. Waiters floated by with trays of wine, careful to avoid bumping into me. I stood near the back, watching, waiting. I had no plan for drama, only for truth to find its way back into the light. Then, just as the lights dimmed for the keynote speech, I saw the security guards moving along the walls. Vanessa whispered something to the coordinator. My jaw tightened. Not again. The guards didn't reach for me this time, they only formed a silent line by the exits, a show of power more than purpose. I felt my pulse steady, not from fear, but from clarity. The lesson hadn't finished yet. Ethan stepped up to the microphone. His voice was calm, his posture rigid. Tonight, he began, we celebrate the growth of Monroe Enterprises and our continued partnership with this foundation. His words were polished, practiced. But halfway through, he paused. His eyes found me in the crowd. I also need to speak of something personal, he said slowly. Someone personal. The audience shifted uneasily. Vanessa's face went pale. This company was built on sacrifice, he continued, voice growing steadier. On years of labor by people who never stood under chandeliers. One of them is here tonight. He gestured toward me. The spotlight swung around. I didn't flinch. My mother, he said. The woman you saw on the front page months ago. You read about how she was humiliated here in this very room. You saw the headlines calling her the cleaning lady who owned it all. He paused, the silence stretching. Every word of it was true. Gasps rippled through the room. Vanessa's hand flew to her chest. Ethan went on, his voice heavy with remorse. She built what we stand on, every dollar, every chance, every roof above us. And I was too blind to see it until the night I let her be thrown out of her own house. He looked down for a moment, then raised his head again, voice thick. That was my failure as a son. And tonight I'm setting it right. I felt the crowd's gaze press in from all sides. Vanessa trembled. The same woman who once called me too plain now looked smaller than her own shadow. Ethan turned to the master of ceremonies. From this moment forward, he said, Monroe Enterprises will operate under its founding name, Caldwell Holdings, to honor the woman who built it with her hands and her silence. Applause didn't come right away. It began as a murmur, then grew slow and genuine. I stood still as a wave of sound filled the room. My heart pounded once, twice, and then calmed. Vanessa stepped toward me, her voice barely audible. You knew he would do this, didn't you? No, I said softly. But I hoped he'd remember who he was. Reporters rushed forward, cameras flashing. The MC called my name, inviting me to the stage. I hesitated, but Ethan extended his hand. The last time I'd seen it, it was trembling with anger. Now it trembled with regret. When I reached the stage, the light was almost blinding. Ethan handed me the microphone, his voice steady but low. Tell them, Mom. Tell them what they should know. I looked out over the crowd, men in tailored suits, women with glittering eyes, all of them holding their breath. I spoke slowly. I spent 30 years cleaning rooms where people left their messes behind. I raised a son on tips and overtime. I believed hard work could buy respect, but I was wrong. Respect isn't for sale. It's earned by remembering who helped you stand. No one moved. I heard a glass clink somewhere at the back, and then silence again. When they called security on me, I said they didn't throw out a guest. They threw out the foundation of everything this company stands for. But I didn't come here for revenge. I came to remind you that the hands that clean your floors might one day sign your paycheck. A few heads bowed. The applause this time was slow, hesitant, but real. I handed the microphone back to Ethan. He didn't speak right away. He just turned to me, eyes wet, and whispered, "I'm sorry." "I know," I said. "Now do better." Vanessa stood frozen, her perfect mask cracking under the lights. For the first time she looked at me not with disdain but with fear, the kind born from recognizing one's own ugliness. The MC stepped forward again, trying to recover the evening's tone. "Let's raise a glass," he said nervously. "To Caldwell Holdings and to Mrs. Monroe." I took my glass, lifted it, and said clearly, "To dignity. It doesn't come with the champagne, it comes with the work." The room roared. Applause thundered from every corner. I saw faces soften, eyes shine. Even Vanessa clapped her smile, trembling but sincere. When it was over, I walked outside alone. The city lights blinked like scattered jewels over the river. Ethan caught up to me near the valet stand. "Mom," he said breathless, "I didn't know how to fix what I broke." "You didn't fix it," I said, turning to face him. "You started cleaning it. That's enough for now." He nodded, shoulders sagging. "Can I walk you to your car?" "You can," I said. "But remember, some walks you have to finish alone." We stood there a moment, neither speaking. Then he hugged me quick and tight before stepping back. For the first time in years I saw the boy who used to chase me down the street with scraped knees and big dreams. As I drove home, the night sky stretched wide and forgiving. The stars didn't shine brighter, they just seemed closer. I realized justice hadn't come from the microphone or the applause or the headlines waiting to be written. It had come from truth spoken plainly under the same chandeliers that once tried to silence me. At a red light I caught my reflection in the window, older, yes, but unbroken. The woman who had once been escorted out, now walked out by choice. I smiled faintly and whispered to the quiet car, "Tonight I didn't reclaim my place, I reclaimed myself." And as the light turned green, the road ahead felt wide open, bright as a second sunrise waiting to begin. The world woke up before I did. By the time I brewed my first cup of coffee, my phone was shaking itself off the counter. Notifications, messages, calls, dozens of them. On every news site, my name flashed under a headline I hadn't written. CEO publicly honors his mother, the hidden owner revealed. Some called it redemption. Others called it spectacle. I just called it mourning. The video from the gala had gone viral overnight. Clips of Ethan's speech filled social media. Hashtags like #hidden-owner, #respect your mothers, and #justice served trended before sunrise. People edited the footage with gospel music and quotes from my speech about dignity. One woman wrote, "She stood where they once told her to leave, and she made the room stand for her." Thousands shared it. I scrolled for a while, half in disbelief, half in quiet amusement. I had lived most of my life invisible. Now strangers called me an icon of grace. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. Fame is just noise, with better lighting. Still, for the first time in decades, the world seemed to listen to a woman who looked like me. By noon, the story had reached the morning shows. A host in a bright suit said, "This isn't just a revenge story, it's a story about rebuilding family." I almost laughed. They made it sound simple, like forgiveness came in gift boxes. It didn't. Forgiveness was a craft. You carved it out with patience and pain. That evening, a van parked across the street. Reporters leaned over my fence shouting questions. "Mrs. Monroe, did you plan it all along? Are you reuniting with your son? How much are you worth?" I stood on the porch with my tea unbothered. "Enough," I said, then closed the door. Inside, the silence hummed like an old song. My small living room smelled of pine, polish, and history. I sat down and let the quiet wrap around me. The world could gossip as it pleased. I had waited too long for peace to trade it for noise. But peace has a way of calling others to your door. That night, Ethan arrived. His suit was wrinkled, his tie gone. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. "Mom," he said softly, standing in the doorway as if afraid to enter. "Come in," I told him. "The world's already inside anyway." He sank into the couch, elbows on his knees. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then he said, "I didn't expect it to explode like this." The board's in a panic. Reporters are calling non-stop. They want interviews. They want you. Let them want, I said. I'm not for sale. He gave a tired laugh. You've always been like that. No, I said. I learned it from you. The difference is, you forgot. He stared at the floor. Vanessa's taking it hard. She's been hiding at home. I stirred my tea. She should try humility. It's good for the complexion. Mom, he said quietly. I know you don't believe me, but she's sorry. I looked at him. His face was thinner than I remembered, the lines sharper. Sorry isn't a word, I said. It's a practice. He didn't argue. Just nodded like a man who'd finally run out of defenses. 3 days later, the headlines turned sharper. Monroe Enterprises faces ethical review. The board suspended Ethan pending evaluation. I read it over breakfast, folded the paper neatly, and whispered. The world moves fast when truth starts rolling downhill. Vanessa's fall was gentler but no less steep. The charity she managed released a statement about inappropriate behavior unbecoming of leadership. She was asked to step down to preserve the organization's values. The same magazines that once praised her taste now picked apart her arrogance. Photos of her at galas became memes. One headline read, "When kindness becomes a luxury, I didn't celebrate." Watching pride crumble isn't joy, it's recognition. I'd been there once too. Crushed under the weight of shame, though mine came from poverty, not vanity. We were the same species of broken, just molded by different pressures. In the weeks that followed, strangers wrote me letters. One woman from Chicago said, "My daughter doesn't talk to me anymore. Watching you gave me hope." A retired teacher sent me a check for $50 for whatever good cause you're doing next. A teenage girl emailed, "I showed your speech to my mom. We cried together." I pinned that one on the fridge. But for every letter of love there was one of cynicism. You just wanted attention. You ruined your son's life. Old people can't let go. I didn't reply. I'd spent a lifetime learning that silence speaks louder than any defense. One afternoon, a talk show producer called. "Mrs. Monroe, America needs to hear your story firsthand," she said brightly. "It's empowering, I already told it," I said, in the only room that mattered. She hesitated. "But don't you want people to know?" "People know enough," I interrupted. "It's time they start remembering." After I hung up, I stood at the window and watched the light shift across the city. Somewhere Ethan was rebuilding his life, one meeting at a time. Somewhere Vanessa was learning how to disappear. And somewhere, maybe my story was teaching people what my silence once couldn't. A week later, Ethan returned. This time he carried no briefcase, no excuses. Just a manila envelope. He sat down across from me and placed it on the table. "What's this?" I asked. "The audit," he said. "You asked for transparency. These are all the assets, all the accounts. It's everything." I flipped through the pages. "You're serious about starting over?" He nodded. "I have to be. After everything, I want to build something clean. I don't care if it's smaller." "That's the first honest thing I've heard from you in years," I said. He exhaled, shoulders dropping. "You were right. Pride is just another kind of poverty." For the first time, I reached across the table and touched his hand. "Then you've learned something money can't teach." The next morning, I declined every interview request. Instead, I called a local community station, the same one that once ran a segment about underpaid cleaning staff. When they asked why I chose them, I said, "Because ordinary voices deserve extraordinary respect." The broadcast aired that weekend. I didn't wear designer clothes or makeup. Just a soft blue sweater, and my truth. The host asked if what I'd done was revenge. "No," I said. "It was justice, and justice doesn't shout. It simply stands back up." Afterward, the producer told me the segment had broken viewership records. People called in crying. A grandmother said she hadn't spoken to her daughter in years, but would call tonight. A nurse said she was going to ask for a raise. That night I sat on the porch, the air smelling of rain and jasmine. The city buzzed quietly in the distance. My phone pinged a message from Ethan. "Saw the interview. I get it now, thank you." I didn't reply right away. I just smiled, setting the phone beside me. The moon hung low, round, and soft, like an old friend who'd been waiting to visit. The next morning I saw the papers again. Public applauds, hidden owner's grace. Below the headline was a photo of me smiling under the copperfinch's chandelier, my son standing beside me. For once, it wasn't a picture of power. It was a picture of peace. I folded the paper, slid it into my drawer and whispered to the quiet house, "The storm's done its work." And for the first time in a long while, I sat down at my kitchen table, poured coffee into my best cup and drank it slowly, not to wake myself but to feel alive again. The rain came the morning the auditors finished their work. Sheets of water ran down the office windows of Caldwell Holdings, washing the city in a pale gray light. I stood beside the glass watching the blur of umbrellas below, thinking how storms always made things cleaner. My lawyer, Mrs. Rowe, cleared her throat softly behind me. "It's all done, Mrs. Monroe," she said. "Every account verified. Every transfer traced." I turned and nodded. On her desk lay a thick folder stamped in gold, "Aurora Holdings Founding Documents, 1998. The ink had faded, but my name still sat there in black letters. Back then it had been nothing more than an idea, and a $60,000 loan I'd saved from 2 decades of night shifts. Now it was the quiet foundation of an empire. Ethan sat across from me, pale but composed. His voice was rough when he spoke. "You really built all of this while I thought you were still working at the warehouse." I met his eyes. "You needed to believe I was small so you could feel big. That was my gift to you. But now it's time you learn where your own height ends." He lowered his gaze, shame and awe blending on his face. Vanessa sat beside him, still and silent, hands clasped in her lap. The shimmer of her wedding ring caught the light, a flash of something once proud, now hollow. Mrs. Rowe opened the folder and began laying out documents. "As you can see, Mrs. Monroe owns 51% of Caldwell Holdings. 20% sits in Aurora's trust, your late father's legacy. The rest belongs to subsidiary partners. For 15 years, she let your branch manage operations without public recognition." Ethan looked stunned. "You mean you were always in control?" "I've never liked the word control," I said. "I prefer stewardship. Control is for those who fear losing power. Stewardship is for those who know power has weight." The room fell quiet except for the hum of rain against the glass. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out another envelope, smaller, thinner, but heavier with purpose. I placed it on the table. "This is the future," I said. Vanessa looked at it warily. "What is that?" "Your next assignment," I replied. "Both of you." Ethan frowned. "Mom, please. Haven't we been through enough humiliation?" "This isn't about humiliation," I said evenly. "It's about rebuilding." I opened the envelope and slid out 3 employment contracts. The company seal gleamed faintly under the fluorescent light. Ethan reached for his first. "Maintenance Division Supervisor," he read aloud. "Starting pay $18 per hour." Vanessa blinked eyes wide. "Kitchen prep, $15 an hour." "Yes," I said. "You'll work the same hours as everyone else, take the same breaks, fill out the same timesheets. No titles, no exceptions." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You want me to mop floors?" "I want you to understand what it means when someone does," I said quietly. Vanessa's voice broke. "You're cruel." I leaned back in my chair. "Cruel would be letting you stay the same." No one spoke for a long moment. The rain softened outside, tapping like a slow metronome. Then Ethan sighed and picked up a pen. "All right," he said, voice low. "If this is what you want." Vanessa turned to him, disbelief etched on her face. "You can't be serious." "I am," he said. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending we earned what we have." I watched him sign his name with a trembling hand. Then Vanessa followed, tears welling but unspilled. When the last signature was in place, I gathered the papers, stacked them neatly and said, "Good, you start Monday." Ethan stood, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Is there any way to make it right, Mom?" I looked at him, not unkindly. "Not yet. But there's always work to be done." They left the office together, moving through the corridor like ghosts. When the door closed, Mrs. Rowe smiled faintly. "You think they'll last?" I shrugged. "They'll either learn or leave. Either way, I'll have peace." That evening I walked through the building after hours. The halls smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and paper. I ran my hand along the polished wood railing, remembering the days when I couldn't afford a proper mop handle. Now, I could buy 1,000, but I still preferred to do it myself sometimes just to remember what the work felt like. In the lobby, a janitor looked up from his mop bucket and froze. "Mrs. Monroe, I didn't see you there." I smiled. "Don't mind me, Henry. I'm just checking if the floors still shine." He chuckled. "They do, ma'am. Always do when you walk through." "Good," I said softly. "That means we're still in business." The next morning I woke before sunrise. The first thing I saw through the blinds was the faint gold light of dawn spilling across the city. The second thing was my reflection lined older but steady. I tied my scarf, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my old leather ledger open in front of me. Page after page of numbers from decades ago, tips, debts, small savings, still marked in blue ink. Beside them I began a new entry. Ethan and Vanessa repayment in honor begins. I paused for a moment, pen hovering above the paper, and whispered, "May this lesson be harder than the work that built it." Later that day I visited the Copperfinch. The smell of roasted garlic and butter filled the kitchen. Chefs moved like clockwork, shouting orders over clattering pans. I asked for the manager. He came out quickly, bowing his head slightly. "Mrs. Monroe." "Everything running smoothly, almost," I said. "We're adding 2 new trainees next week. Treat them like everyone else. No special treatment, no gossip." "You understand, of course," he said. "Names?" I smiled faintly. "Ethan and Vanessa Monroe." His eyes widened for half a second, then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am, understood." When I stepped back outside, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds. The air smelled clean again. I stood for a long moment under that light, feeling the strange quiet satisfaction of setting things in motion, not out of spite, but balance. I thought of Marcus, my late husband, and how he used to say, "Every life has 2 kinds of debt, money and morals. The first you can pay, the second you must live." Now it was time for my children to start living theirs. That evening, I sat by the window with the city lights glittering below like scattered coins. My phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "We'll be there Monday. Thank you for not giving up on us." I smiled and set it aside. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly, but it didn't frighten me. Storms were just part of the cleansing. I poured a glass of wine, lifted it toward the window, and whispered to the reflection staring back at me, "This isn't revenge, it's renewal." And somewhere deep in that quiet night, the city exhaled with me, ready for whatever new chapter waited at dawn. The first Monday arrived gray and cold, the kind of morning that strips pride bare. At 6 a.m., Ethan stood outside the employee entrance of the main Caldwell building, wearing a Navy maintenance uniform instead of his tailored suit. The embroidered name Patch E. Monroe looked foreign on his chest. He kept touching it, as if hoping it would vanish. Inside, the security guard nodded politely, but didn't salute him like before. Just a quick morning, the same greeting given to every worker. It was the first lesson, respect earned, not inherited. Down the street at the Copperfinch, Vanessa adjusted a paper cap over her perfect hair and tied her apron with trembling hands. The kitchen heat hit her like punishment. Steam rose from pots, and the clang of metal pans echoed around her. A cook handed her a tray of vegetables and said flatly, "Chop." When she hesitated, he added, "We don't got all day, lady." She started cutting too slow, the knife slipping against the slick wood. After the third uneven slice, he sighed. "You'll learn. I didn't show up to see it, I didn't need to. I'd seen those lessons before in my own skin 30 years ago. But around noon the manager sent me a short message. They showed up on time. No complaints, just quiet. I read it twice and whispered, "Good. Let the silence teach them." At the end of the day, I called my lawyer, Mrs. Rowe. "Put the repayment schedule into effect," I said. 70% of their wages go toward the moral debt account. "Will that be public record?" she asked. "No," I replied. "Humiliation was yesterday's teacher. Today's is accountability." The next weeks passed like sand through an hourglass. Ethan learned to scrub floors until they shone, to wipe mirrors without streaks, to empty trash bins without wrinkling his nose. The janitorial supervisor, a man half his age, corrected him often, and without sympathy. One day when Ethan forgot to restock paper towels, the supervisor barked, "If the CEO's son can't follow protocol, maybe he ain't cut for cleaning." Ethan didn't argue. He just nodded and fixed it. At night, he came home to the worker dorms on the east side, thin walls, narrow bed, flickering lights. His hands smelled of detergent, his back ached, and he finally understood why I always groaned when standing up after long shifts. He wrote in his journal, "I used to think my mother exaggerated. Now I know she just endured quietly." Vanessa's journey was slower, harder. The first few days she cried in the restroom between shifts. By the second week, her blisters healed into calluses. By the third, she stopped checking her reflection in the metal door. The kitchen crew teased her less. They started showing her tricks: how to peel onions without tears, how to keep the oil from spattering. One night, the head chef, a broad man with tired eyes, told me she'd stayed late to clean after closing. "Didn't even flinch when the sink clogged," he said. "You were right, she's learning." I visited the Copper Finch on a Friday evening just before closing. She was at the sink arms, deep in soapy water, hair frizzed from steam. When she noticed me, her eyes widened. "Mrs. Monroe, I told you to call me Ella," I said. "How's the work?" "Hard," she admitted. "But not as bad as I thought." "Hard usually isn't bad," I said softly. "It's just honest." She nodded, and for the first time she didn't look away. At the end of that week, I received Ethan's first report. Hours worked 47. Performance satisfactory. Supervisor note: he's trying too hard not to look tired. That line made me smile. Tiredness had been my lifelong shadow. Maybe now it would be his mentor. I didn't gloat. I didn't visit to inspect. I let time and humility do what lectures couldn't. By the third week, their faces began appearing online again, but this time through a different lens. Someone at the office posted a candid photo of Ethan kneeling to clean a spill in the lobby. Caption: "When the boss's son scrubs beside you, respect becomes policy." It went viral. Another photo showed Vanessa smiling shyly while plating bread for the staff meal. The internet called it redemption in progress. But not everyone was kind. Some commenters mocked them, "They deserve it," or "Too little too late." I ignored it. Redemption isn't for headlines, it's for the quiet hours between shame and courage. After a month, I summoned them both to my office. They arrived still in uniform, the faint smell of bleach and roasted garlic trailing behind. I gestured for them to sit. Neither spoke. "How are you managing?" I asked. Vanessa's voice cracked. "I didn't think I could do it, but I'm beginning to understand. There's something peaceful about earning your place, even if it's small." Ethan nodded. "I don't hate Mondays anymore. Work makes sense now." I folded my hands on the desk. "Good, you've both started repaying your debt." Vanessa looked startled. "The money?" "No," I said. "The one you can't measure with interest." Ethan leaned forward. "Mom, I don't know if I can ever make that right." "You can," I said. "By remembering. Memory is the only currency that doesn't lose value." They left the office quieter than they came. When the door closed, I sat back, my heart heavier but softer. Power doesn't thrill me anymore. Watching someone rediscover decency, that's the only luxury worth keeping. 2 weeks later, they began their volunteer shifts at the senior home Silver Pines. It was the same place I once donated to anonymously. On their first day, the coordinator emailed me. They came early, helped set up lunch, no complaints. The residents liked them. The second week I visited, Ethan was pushing an old man in a wheelchair down the hallway. Vanessa sat beside a woman knitting by the window, listening as she told stories about her children who never visited. I stood unseen for a while watching. Ethan's hand was gentle on the wheelchair handles. Vanessa laughed softly at something the old woman said, her shoulders no longer stiff. When they finally noticed me, both froze. I smiled. "Don't stop, you're doing something good." Ethan swallowed hard. "We're trying. I can see that," I said. "Keep at it. Dignity likes practice." That night as I drove home, rain began again, thin silver cleansing. I rolled down the window and let it cool my face. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement like a trail leading somewhere better. At home, I opened my old ledger again and wrote a single new line beneath their names. Progress noted not by words, but by work. For years I had built a life out of silence, believing that kindness required endurance. Now watching them stumble toward humility, I realized something different. Kindness is endurance, yes, but only when it finally learns to speak. When I closed the book, I caught my reflection in the glass cabinet, gray hair, steady eyes, no bitterness left. The woman staring back at me wasn't the one who'd been thrown out of a ballroom. She was the one who had built her own stage from the ground up. Outside thunder murmured low in the distance, but it didn't sound like warning anymore. It sounded like applause. The sky was still dark when Ethan woke to his alarm. For the first time in years he didn't dread the sound. He dressed quietly, pulling on the same uniform he'd worn for weeks, the one that smelled faintly of disinfectant and soap. Outside, the city was barely stirring. As he walked toward the Caldwell building, streetlights hummed over slick pavement. He passed the glass doors he used to stride through with a briefcase and pride. Now he entered through the side where the janitors clocked in. Inside, the air was cool and sharp with polish. The night shift was ending, and 2 cleaners nodded at him in greeting. "Morning, Ethan." "No, sir," no hesitation, just respect, the kind that wasn't for sale. He grabbed his cart and started his rounds, humming softly as he worked. Every time the mop glided over the marble, he thought of me. At the same hour across town, Vanessa stepped into the Copper Finch kitchen. The air was already thick with the smell of onions, yeast, and steam. She tied her apron tighter, checked her station, and began slicing vegetables. The head chef, a big man named Harold, watched for a moment before grunting. "You're early again." "I like quiet," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Quiet's where the work speaks loudest." She smiled faintly and kept cutting. The knife no longer shook in her hand. The rhythm of the blade, the hiss of the stove, the murmur of the other cooks, it all blended into a strange kind of peace. I didn't visit them that day. I'd promised myself to stop hovering. Instead, I went to the office early and reviewed the employee reports. The lines were simple, punctual, consistent, respectful. Every note felt like a prayer answered. They were learning the hard way, but they were learning. At noon, I took a walk through the main building. The halls gleamed under soft light. Near the elevators, I saw Ethan kneeling, wiping a scuff mark from the marble. He didn't see me right away. When he looked up, surprise flashed in his eyes, followed by something warmer, pride without ego. "Floor looks good," I said. He wiped sweat from his forehead. "I figured it should, considering who built it." "You're starting to sound like a manager again," I said with a smile. He stood, stretching his back. "Maybe one day. For now, I'm fine being the one who keeps it clean." I nodded. "Keep at it. Leadership grows best from the ground up." Later that week, the Copper Finch held a staff meeting. Harold asked each team member to cook one dish that represented who they were. When it was Vanessa's turn, she hesitated, then began preparing a simple soup: carrots, celery, chicken broth, a hint of thyme. The others watched quietly as she stirred. "It's nothing fancy," she said, "just something my grandmother used to make when we couldn't afford much. She said soup was love you could share." When they tasted it, the room went silent. One of the line cooks said softly, "That's the best thing I've eaten all week." Harold clapped her shoulder. "Keep cooking like that, and you'll earn more than tips, you'll earn respect." That night, Vanessa went home exhausted but light. For the first time, her hands ached in a way that felt worthwhile. She texted me a single sentence before bed: "Now I understand what you meant by honest work." I read it twice and smiled. The weeks turned into months. Ethan began staying late to help the security team organize supplies. He learned how to polish glass until it gleamed without streaks, how to strip and wax floors in steady strokes. When his supervisor called in sick, Ethan covered his shift without complaint. The next day, the staff bought him coffee and said, "Didn't think you had it in you, boss." He laughed at the word but didn't correct them. At the same time, Vanessa grew into her role quietly. The staff stopped calling her the lady with soft hands. She started mentoring new hires, teaching them small tricks: how to balance plates, how to stay calm when orders piled up. One night when a delivery ran late, she took charge, reorganizing the prep line so smoothly that Harold later said, "If you keep that up, I'll make you my right hand." The old arrogance was gone, replaced by a humility that glowed through her posture. She didn't bow her head anymore, she carried it steady, grounded in purpose instead of pride. Meanwhile, their volunteer shifts at Silver Pines continued. Ethan fixed leaky faucets and broken lamps. Vanessa served oatmeal and folded laundry. The residents adored them. One afternoon, an elderly man clasped Ethan's hand and said, "You remind me of my boy. He doesn't visit, but I can see you'd understand." Ethan blinked hard, squeezing the man's hand before walking out to breathe. Vanessa, meanwhile, sat with a woman who'd lost her sight. They hummed hymns together in the sunlight. "You've got a gentle heart," the woman said. "Don't let the world make it hard again." Vanessa promised she wouldn't. Every Friday, Elliot, the manager I'd worked with for years, sent me progress reports. He never used fancy words, just facts. They show up, they work, they listen. That was all I needed to hear. But it wasn't just their hands changing, it was their voices. One afternoon I stopped by Silver Pines to drop off donations. I heard laughter echoing from the dining hall. There they were, Ethan setting up a chessboard with an old veteran, Vanessa arranging flowers with two women. The way they moved was different now, careful, present, grateful. When I stepped inside, the old man looked up. "You must be Mrs. Monroe," he said. "They talk about you like you're the reason the sun rises." I chuckled. "The sun doesn't need my permission." Ethan turned his face, breaking into a genuine smile. "Mom, I didn't expect you. I wanted to see what hard work looks like on you," I said. "It suits you." He laughed softly, and Vanessa joined in. For the first time, I felt peace between us, not the fragile truce of guilt, but something real and lasting. That evening, as I drove home, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in amber and rose. I pulled over near the bridge and watched the lights scatter across the water. The city hummed behind me, alive and restless, but in that moment I felt only stillness. I thought of Marcus, of the promises I'd made at his grave to raise our son right, to hold our dignity even when life tried to strip it away. It had taken decades and heartbreak, but maybe finally I'd kept that promise. At home, I opened my ledger once more. Under the line marked progress, I wrote, "They have begun to understand the language of sweat. One day they'll speak it fluently." I closed the book and placed it on the windowsill. Outside, the first stars blinked into view. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I whispered to the dark, "Let the work keep teaching them." And somewhere far across the city, I imagined Ethan finishing his shift, wiping his hands on a rag, Vanessa washing the last dish of the night. Two people once blinded by pride, now humbled into grace. The sound of running water, the scent of soap, the warmth of tired muscles, those were the real lessons. Work was the greatest equalizer, the truest mirror. It had cleaned not just their hands but their hearts. And as sleep pulled me under, I thought perhaps that's what love really is. Not a word, not a debt, but the quiet willingness to help someone learn how to live again. The air in Atlanta had the clean bite of winter when I opened my curtains that morning. Frost traced silver veins across the glass, and for the first time in years I didn't feel cold. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel like loneliness but now sounded like peace. On my kitchen table lay 3 envelopes sealed and stamped with the word "completed." They were the contracts my children had signed 1 year ago. The paper had aged around the edges, but the ink, the promise, still held. At Caldwell Holdings, Ethan was learning what true leadership looked like. His team called him the boss who sweeps. The janitorial staff adored him, and the office crew trusted him. He'd spent months working among them side by side, never raising his voice. One of his reports had reached my desk that week: morale up 17%, 0 turnover, cleanest floors in company history. I laughed softly when I read it. Progress, I thought, is sometimes measured in footprints instead of dollars. Vanessa had bloomed quietly at the Copperfinch. The once perfect wife who could barely boil water now ran the midday kitchen. When local newspapers came to write about the restaurant's success, they described her as calm, focused, and unpretentious. I went to see her the night before the charity event she was organizing. The kitchen glowed gold, warm from ovens and laughter. She looked up from a pot of soup, her face flushed, her hair tied back, a streak of flour on her cheek. "You shouldn't be out in this weather," she said softly. "I've walked through worse," I said. "I just wanted to see how you're doing." She hesitated, then said, "I think I'm finally earning what I used to demand." "Good," I replied. "It tastes better that way." The next evening I attended the charity dinner, sitting quietly at the back of the room. The lights glittered, and the hum of conversation felt like an orchestra tuning before truth. Vanessa stepped up to the microphone, voice trembling just once before she steadied it. "This dinner," she said, "is for the people who taught us that dignity doesn't come from wealth but from work. My mother-in-law showed me that." Heads turned toward me and I lowered my eyes, not out of shame but gratitude. Ethan stood near the wall with his maintenance team. They wore clean uniforms, their hands calloused but proud. When our eyes met, he raised his glass slightly, and I did the same. That small, wordless gesture said everything that apologies never could. After the dinner, he walked me to my car. The parking lot shimmered under the soft glow of streetlights. "Mom," he said, shoving his hands in his pockets, "they want me to take the head of operations job permanently. It's a real position, salary, benefits, all of it. But I wanted to ask you first." I smiled at him. "Why me?" "Because every time I think I know what success is, I hear your voice asking if I've forgotten how to mop." "Then take the job," I said. "Just keep your broom close. Pride gets heavy when you stop carrying humility beside it." He nodded, eyes bright in the cold. "You'll come see the new office, won't you, when the floors shine?" I said. "That's when I'll know you're ready." Spring crept in, soft as breath. Mason's project, the renewal complex, was finally under construction on the city's east side. Affordable housing, a playground, a small garden. "I want people to feel proud of where they live," he told me. His hands were rough, the kind that knew both failure and repair. I placed mine over his and said, "Build it strong, son. Foundations carry more than walls." By April, Vanessa began dropping by my house every Sunday. She never came empty-handed. Soup, bread, sometimes flowers she'd bought on sale at the farmer's market. She'd linger at the doorway, eyes wandering across the old wooden table, the chipped cups, the photographs on the wall. "It smells like peace in here," she said once, almost to herself. "Peace," I told her, "is just the sound of a lesson finishing." She smiled faintly. "Then I hope mine never ends." At Silver Pines, the nursing home they volunteered at, the staff sent me updates every month. "Your family's our favorite crew," one message read. "They fix things we didn't even know were broken." I went there one afternoon to see for myself. They were in the courtyard repainting benches, the scent of pine sap and paint hanging in the warm air. Ethan looked up first. "You came," he said, surprised. "You saved me a brush, didn't you?" I teased. Mason grinned. "We'll always have an extra one for you." Vanessa handed me a can of paint. "Be careful. It stains easily." "Some stains," I said, dipping the brush, "are worth keeping." We painted together in silence, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. The sunlight fell through the trees, and for a moment I thought of Marcus, my husband, and the promise I'd made him decades ago, to raise children strong enough to stand, humble enough to kneel. That afternoon I knew I'd kept it. That night I sat at my desk and opened the ledger that had carried every season of my life, my first savings, my losses, my revenge, my peace. I turned to the last page and wrote in steady ink, "Honor repaid in full. Balance transferred to love." The next morning I invited all three of them to dinner. When they arrived, the table was already set, with roast chicken, greens, and cornbread, the same meal we'd shared when they were children. We ate quietly at first. Then Ethan set down his fork. "Mom," he said, "I used to think work was punishment. Now I think it's prayer." Vanessa nodded. "And forgiveness too." Mason smiled. "It's both. Sometimes the same thing." I looked around the table, their faces softer, their hands rougher, their eyes finally honest, and I realized I no longer needed to test them. They had rebuilt what I'd once buried. When dinner ended, I gathered their contracts from the counter and set them on the table. "You don't owe me anymore," I said. "If you wish to stop, you can." Ethan shook his head. "We'll finish what we started. Not because we have to, but because we want to." Vanessa reached for his hand. "The work changed us. It gave us back what we'd lost," Mason said quietly. "You. It gave us you." The room blurred for a moment. I blinked hard and smiled. "Then my debt is paid too." When they left, I stood in the doorway, watching their car fade into the dusk. The streetlights flickered on soft halos in the dark. I closed the door and leaned against it, the warmth of their laughter still echoing in the hall. For the first time in a lifetime of building, cleaning, mending, I didn't feel the need to fix a single thing. Before bed, I wrote one last note at the bottom of the ledger: work finished. Love remains. Then I closed the book, turned off the lights, and whispered into the quiet, Marcus, we did it. They came home. 5 years later, the Copper Finch no longer sparkled like the exclusive restaurant it once was. It glowed with something softer, warmer. The sign above the door read, Second Chance Kitchen. It wasn't a marketing trick or rebrand, it was a promise. The kind of promise only time and pain can make. We hired people others had thrown away, laid off workers, single mothers, men who had lost their footing after decades of climbing the wrong ladders. I didn't run the kitchen anymore, but I came often, always taking the same corner table beneath the bronze plaque that read, Dignity is the house special here. Every time I looked at it, I smiled. Ethan had become the kind of leader I used to dream he'd be. He now managed 2 mid-range hotels in the Caldwell Holdings Group. Nothing flashy, no luxury 5-star chains, just steady, honest work with staff who stayed because he treated them like partners. His employees called him Mr. Monroe, the boss who still carries a broom. He never corrected them. Once he told me, Mom, leadership isn't standing in front anymore. It's clearing the path so everyone can walk. Vanessa had taken over the lunch program at the Copper Finch. She designed the entire menu for seniors and recovering patients, food that healed, not impressed. A local magazine gave her an award for her heartwarming cuisine. In her speech, she said, I used to cook for praise. Now I cook for peace. I watched from the crowd and clapped slowly the applause, not just for her, but for the quiet revolution that happens when someone stops performing and starts serving. Mason and Tessa married 3 years ago in the small garden behind Silver Pines. The sky was pale gold, the air filled with pine and laughter. The ceremony was simple, no extravagance, no glittering lights, just sincerity. Grant stood as best man, Vanessa as maid of honor. The 4 of them smiled like they were building something new together, not fixing something old. When Mason slipped the ring onto Tessa's hand, he said, We won't promise to never be wrong, only to never stay silent when we are. It was the first time I cried in public and didn't feel ashamed. That same evening, after everyone left, I placed 3 envelopes on the table, my final update to my will. I made it clear, most of my estate would continue to fund the Second Sunrise Foundation, the project born from that storm of humiliation years ago. The rest wouldn't be gifts but opportunities. Ethan would oversee 2 hotels that needed rebuilding, Vanessa would own a share of the Copper Finch, and Mason would lead the conversion of old worker housing into a community complex called Hector's Light, named after the elderly chess player who'd once taught my son humility in defeat. When they read the papers, no one argued. They simply nodded, as if they finally understood that legacy wasn't about money but stewardship. Money can build walls, I told them, but honor builds homes. In the years that followed, the Second Sunrise Fund grew beyond my imagination. We expanded to 7 cities: Atlanta, Charleston, Nashville, Charlotte, Raleigh, Birmingham, and Savannah. We helped hundreds of seniors rebuild their lives after being abandoned, giving them legal help, safe homes, and the confidence to live without shame. Whenever journalists asked me why I gave so much away, I said, because I already have enough. What I receive now isn't stored in banks, it lives in people's eyes when they realize they matter again. Sometimes I'd walk through the Copper Finch during lunch hour, unnoticed by most of the diners. The sound of laughter, plates clinking, and jazz humming low filled the air. Vanessa would be at the counter, steady and graceful, tasting soup, correcting a young cook's posture. She'd catch my eye and smile. Try today's special, she'd call out. I always did. The soup, her simple vegetable broth, tasted like the same kind of forgiveness that had rebuilt our family, warm, quiet, and patient. Ethan often dropped by after his shifts. Mom, he'd say, you know what, the staff calls me now, what, the boss, who knows how to clean toilets, he'd grin. And I'm proud of it. Mason and Tessa spent their weekends at Silver Pines, now renovated with new benches, fresh paint, and a bright common hall. They taught seniors how to use smartphones, how to make video calls to their children. So no one ever has to wait years for a call that never comes, Tessa once said. Watching them, I realized my story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about return, the kind that brings people home to who they were always meant to be. My book came out that spring, Mopping Hours Pay Dividends. It wasn't a memoir, not really, but a collection of lessons, what I learned from the smell of floor cleaner, from rejection, from finding worth in quiet labor. The profits, of course, went straight to Second Sunrise. When a reporter asked why I didn't keep any, I laughed. Because peace doesn't need interest. Every month we kept a small tradition family dinner at my kitchen table. The same old table, the same chicken soup we'd shared the night everything fell apart. We didn't talk about business or legacy. We talked about small things, how the city smelled after rain, what books we were reading, what the grandchildren were learning. Laughter came easier now. Sometimes, when the soup steamed between us, I looked at their hands, the same hands that once trembled with pride or guilt, and saw nothing but grace. One night as we cleared the table, Ethan said softly, "I never thought we'd sit here again." I smiled. "Some cracks never mend," I said. "But you can plant flowers in them." Vanessa wiped a tear from her cheek. "They bloom brighter that way." When they left that night, the house stayed warm long after the door closed. I washed the last dish and sat by the window. Outside the street was quiet, the lamplight catching the bare trees, like veins of gold. The oven light glowed behind me, a small constant flame that had never gone out, not even in the darkest nights. A few months later, Elliot, my old partner and dear friend, came to visit, now retired and slower on his feet. He handed me a small wrapped bundle. "You remember this?" he asked, unwrapping it gently. Inside was the rusted key to the first office we ever rented for Caldwell Holdings. "I think it belongs to you," he said. This key opened more than doors. I held it in my palm. The metal was worn, but it still caught the light. "Thank you," I whispered, "for keeping it safe when I couldn't." He smiled. "You were always the one who built things to last." After he left, I hung the key on the wall beside the plaque from the copper finch. The sunlight through the window made both shine faintly, like two pieces of history greeting each other. Now most mornings I write from that same kitchen about endurance, about family, about the strange grace that only comes after losing everything. I no longer measure my life in years or dollars, but in lessons and second chances. My children have built their own worlds, but every week they still call. Every month they still come home. And when they do, I always leave the oven light on. Because sometimes that's all anyone needs, a small light waiting for them to find their way back. If this story has reached you tonight, tell me where you're watching from. Maybe you've walked through your own kind of storm, maybe you're still in it. Either way, I hope you remember, dignity never dies, it only waits for you to claim it. And if you believe stories like this still matter, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or simply say hello. It's how we keep the light on for one another.